Welcome to the third webinar in the series Learning from Connected Communities, an in-depth look at nature-based climate solutions in Atlantic Canada, focused on mapping natural assets and responding to the impacts of climate change. My name is Lily Barraclough, and I'm a project coordinator with the New Brunswick Environmental Network on a project supporting municipalities across New Brunswick with building the capacity to implement nature-based climate solutions in response to the climate crisis. Bonjour tout le monde, bienvenue à le troisième webinaire.
So repeating now in French.
Climatique fondée sur la nature. Pour la session aujourd'hui, on va
For today's session, we're going to learn about efforts, management efforts, and natural assets. I'm Lily Barraclough. We have a project that offers support to municipalities across New Brunswick with nature-based climate
We have
solutions.
Simultaneous interpretation available today. We will have one presentation in French and one in English, and during the question period, you may pose a question in the language of your choice. If you would like to hear everything today in English, please find the interpretation button on the bottom right of your screen and then select English to hear today's event in English. And si vous voulez écouter cet événement aujourd'hui en français,
if you want to listen in French today, you can click on the interpretation button at the bottom of the screen and click on French to listen in that language.
I just want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from the unceded traditional territory of Mi'kmaq. But the New Brunswick Environmental Network does work across the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq, Wolastoqey, and Passamaquoddy peoples. And as we talk about adapting to climate change, it's incredibly important to also acknowledge that responding to the impacts of the climate crisis also involves working towards decolonization and reconciliation with the Indigenous peoples across this land. So for those of you who may not be aware, the New Brunswick Environmental Network, it was established in 1991, and we are a communication network that links over 110 nonprofit environmental organizations across New Brunswick. And the New Brunswick Environmental Network, we have a long history of doing work around nature-based climate solutions in response to the climate crisis, and through past work building capacity with professionals, engineers, and planners across the province in the Building Regional Adaptation Capacity and Expertise Project. As I mentioned, this is the third webinar in a series of webinars that we are hosting along with Climate Atlantic and Nature NB during the month of June and at the beginning of July. So we encourage you to keep an eye out for our upcoming webinars after this one on hybrid infrastructure approaches, living shorelines, and some that are yet to be confirmed on wetlands, as well as conserving nature to respond to the climate crisis. So with that, I would like to introduce our first speaker of today, Dodek Gassé. Dodek est un chercheur en écologie appliquée et
Dodek is an applied environmental and ecological researcher and has experience in ecological organizations, sustainable management of forests, sustainable management of agricultural waste, etc. And so I'm going to turn it over to Dodek now, and thank you very much.
Bon, je vais partager mon écran. Bonjour tout le monde. Voyez-vous bien l'écran en mode diaporama? Oui, OK. Bon, mais bonjour tout le monde. Good afternoon, everybody. Merci beaucoup pour l'invitation. Ça me fait plaisir. C'est l'écran suivant. Premièrement, je vais vous parler très brièvement de Innov. de l'employeur pour lequel je travaille. Donc, Innov est affilié au Collège communautaire du Nouveau-Brunswick et possède 3 divisions, bioéconomie à Grand-Sault, fabrication de pointe à Caraquette et matériaux de pointe, fabrication de pointe à Bathurst et matériaux de pointe à Caraquette. Moi, je travaille au niveau de la division bioéconomie, puis plus précisément au niveau de l'agriculture et de l'environnement. La mission d'Innov, c'est d'être partenaire de choix pour les entreprises et les organisations, comme les municipalités, par exemple, dans la réalisation de leurs projets d'innovation et de recherche appliquée. Puis la vision, c'est de devenir la référence incontournable dans nos champs d'expertise en recherche appliquée et innovation au Nouveau-Brunswick. Nous développons 3 initiatives. Je vais vous parler de la première initiative aujourd'hui. Puis qui dit initiative dit plusieurs projets. Donc, la première initiative, c'est l'adaptation aux impacts des changements climatiques et toute la question de la gestion de l'eau, l'enjeu de l'eau. La deuxième initiative, c'est l'atténuation des changements climatiques avec l'aspect du carbone et l'utilisation de solutions naturelles ou solutions fondées sur la nature pour favoriser la séquestration du carbone.
Nature-based solutions to favor sequestration of carbon. And so I can give you more information on that second initiative. And the third initiative has more to do with biodiversity. For instance, improving habitat for natural pollinators in blueberry patches, and also improving finding ecological solutions for in this area. So I'm going to focus on the first initiative today and the issue of water. Sorry, I think your slides aren't changing. Perhaps you're not in presentation mode. Perhaps you have a second screen. Yes, I have 2 screens. That's correct. Sorry, what do I need to do?
Non.
La présente. Screen. Attendez, là, il y a... vous voyez la présentation?
Can you see the presentation?
Oui, mais sur la mode avec editing mode, c'est dans le PowerPoint.
It's in editing mode right now. It's not in presentation mode. So if I put in I have to change the mode, correct? If it's not working, I think you have to change the slides as you go in PowerPoint mode, because unfortunately we don't have enough time to figure it out. Can you see my slide? Yes. Okay, great. I think it's working now. Perfect, thank you. So I was here. Okay, so as we all know, we're facing a new climate reality, and there is an increase in uncertainty regarding the climate, and municipalities are facing several challenges and several complexities. And to mention just a few, well, there's everything to do with getting potable water, treating water, managing rainwater. There can be episodes of floods, local ones, but there's also contamination of water courses. In terms of climate change impacts, they're seeing more and more frequent events, and there are risks for health and safety for citizens with these extreme weather events. And there's a certain level of urbanization as well. So there's an increase in impermeable surfaces as well. So that has everything that affects water. And so quickly before going forward, a little remember of nature-based services. So there's the whole there's the whole concept of natural capital, that is ecosystems, everything that has to do with nature. And so there are ecosystem benefits, so that is for people, for the population, which are, so we distinguish between abundant water or ecosystem services, which can be, for instance, water purification. And so, as you know, well, health and wellness has an impact on human populations, and we depend on these systems. So it's good to have ecosystems that are healthy and productive and not degraded. So our approach, what we try to do is to specify the roles of these natural ecosystems to provide a good idea to decision makers and to people who are involved in the landscaping to make sure that we have a rigorous process that's based on the best knowledge available and using scientific processes. And so we work, we have a lot of collaborations, and we work at various different spatial and time
des années contemporaines au
which, as we examine the impacts of climate change until the end of the century. And so we several resources that characterize these ecosystems and the services that are affiliated with them. And so we're advancing with our planning, and then in terms of application, well, that is more up to the municipalities and communities. And so our solutions are, well, we're preventive multifunctional solutions, so direct benefits, but also being aware of social and environmental factors. And these are sustainable solutions. So the three dimensions of sustainable development are considered. Obviously, these are ecological, so it's based on natural ecosystems. And we want them to be solutions. And when we say nature-based, well, these are simple solutions that are usually quite affordable and easier to accept in terms of the social impact as well, and they're resilient to disruption. So that's the logic behind this. So I'm going to quickly go over all of the projects. I don't want to present each and every one of them that are underway, but some of them, be it the integrated plan for beavers. So we have 4 different ones. We have the hydrology, the regenerative hydrology, we have geospatial technologies, we have multifunctional solutions. There's nature-based solutions, and then of course we have integrated management of catchment basins. So this is how we got started with this initiative. We wanted Étang Boucher did an assessment of natural solutions, and he's in this municipality has had a terrain that has been degraded over the last few years, and over the years, and so there's a certain level of integrity, and there are ecological services that are provided, ecosystem services that are offered to the municipalities for managing various surfaces, and also dealing with heat waves. And so the objective here, the goal, was to sort of have a natural park that would showcase, education and awareness raising for students and regular citizens. And so we have several projects that are underway since 2017, where we're using Westpac. Westpac, where we evaluated 120
services écosystémiques.
different wetlands in the area. So we try to look at the ecosystemic services that are offered in these wetlands. And so here's the map. There's an analogy in the middle you see with the ear, with the kidney, because we can make an analogy there because it's kind of to clean up the body, and so we had to map all of our results and put them on a map and present retention of sediments, for instance, and their relative contribution to this in terms of sediment retention. And so that is the role of wetlands, purifying surface water. And so another bassin, the Five Fingers, which is the managing potable water for this municipality here. I wanted to emphasize the capacity to recharge this hydrographic basin is located in several catchment basins, and it's probably quite vulnerable over the coming decades due to the lack of availability of water. It's the municipality that actually is going to be quite vulnerable in terms of their water supply. So I wanted to emphasize the role of so I wanted to evaluate their ability to recharge the groundwater table in order to supply water to these municipalities. This is what I was looking at here, and the effects that it will have on these municipalities. So this approach allowed us to specify the role of wetlands and to look at the level of health and also get a picture of the factors of degradation and other limiting factors, and to try to identify conservation priorities. This is something that we're developing. It's an emerging discipline, really. Monetary assessments of these ecosystem services, and we want to try to go beyond the physical assessment and to sort of put a dollar sign on or a dollar figure on the services that are offered. We didn't do this for biodiversity because that's our issue here is really with water. So we wanted to look at it in terms of the maintaining the quality of drinking water. So we adapted a methodology. We created a toolbox for various different things. But to give you a few estimates, so we see that there's a big variability. But if we look at the median for maintaining the quality of water, we're talking about $3,500 per hectare per year. So these are services. If we lost wetlands, well, we'd have to replace it with, how would I say it, infrastructure, conventional infrastructure. And what we're observing is that depending on the type of wetland, this ecosystem services have a quite high, cost, monetary cost, and so peatlands, for instance, cost more than some other types of swamps, etc. And so, looking at these, the beaver management, we looked at this for 5 years, and in terms of the context, the background, well, over the Saint-Quentin, the city had a strategy to eliminate beavers because they did a study that was based on disease, waterborne disease, so they realized that the risk was quite low, actually. And the beaver is not really the culprit, but they can be a big ally, in fact, in terms of climate change, because they can create wetlands, and so they foster purification of water and also recharging, like I said, of the groundwater table. And so what we proposed, instead of wanting to eradicate every last beaver, because that's a lot of work and that costs a lot of money as well. So maybe it would be more judicious, we figured, to try to optimize and be more strategic to minimize the impacts and the negative impacts of beavers in certain sectors and in other sectors in which it can be beneficial or where there's no conflict, if you will, between beavers' activities, and we can have a nice cohabitation between beavers and take advantage of the benefits that they provide. So this is Saint-Quentin, the city of Saint-Quentin. They were very open to our proposal, and I think they're going to start applying this strategic change. Another project in terms of the impact, well, the hydrology and quality of water across this catchment basin. So we looked at ground cover and using the land to improve the hydrology and the quality of water. And so this is a large area of 500,000 square kilometers. And so we made this map and we sort of divided it into functional groups. And so we have 30 different categories of land cover. And so we grouped this by qualitatively based on an expert analysis, whether they provide negative or positive impacts. And in urban environments, it's quite negative, and in rural environments, it's quite positive. So this allows us to spatially analyze the impact on the territory based on the hydrology and the quality of water. And so in a more quantitative manner, we did a first sort of a roundtable, if you will, in terms of drainage basin. And so we looked at several catchment basins in the region, and we want to use the INVEST platform, create models for various scenarios, and then optimize our strategies, our landscaping strategies, and also our protection and restoration of natural assets. So there's a lot of modeling here, and optimization is quite complex, but this is work that we're going to be continuing on with in the coming months. So that's about it. Just to end on with this portion, this work is going to allow us to characterize catchment basins and to see what the impacts were on hydrology and catchment basins, the impacts of climate change on those things, and then also protection and restoration and investment in natural assets in this context of climate change. So that's going to allow us to identify actions and priority sectors for intervention in the with the goal of trying to assure source of drinking water, and also to improve our way of landscaping these areas. In Saint-Quentin, the city of Saint-Quentin, there's conservation of agricultural soils and preservation of water quality. So this is a parcel that's just upstream of the source of potable water for the city, and so there was a sort of high acidity in the water. And formerly and currently, kind of this came under INNOV, but there's also the whole work that was done in terms of establishing terraces and grassed areas, and conservation of soils and preservation of water quality. Others are participating in a living lab as well. And so we have 5 sites that we're managing in this region. And we also launched a project to follow up on cover cropping across the whole region in terms of potato production. So these are projects that are also connected to this issue of water. And beyond the establishment of terraces and the grassy areas, like I mentioned, there's a lot of innovation, and we've got sort of more integrated approaches, and so that's something to take into consideration as well. So I'm obviously glossing over several of these, but this is a significant project. We worked on a project on a catchment basin in the Edmundston area. It's the Trout River one, and we established a strategy to mitigate the risk of flooding using nature-based solutions and natural solutions. And we used two different methodologies for this, multifactorial. So we're seeing one of the multi-criteria analysis things here, and then you can see that the floodplain establishing this floodplain was something that we prioritized, and so we looked at the main benefits of this, and we have 10 or 15 nature-based solutions that we put in place there. And so once we had sort of prioritized them and put them in order, we created scenarios according to three orientations. So overall there's overall performance, but it's developing sustainable development. There's an emphasis also on the economic things, but also the mitigation of the risk of flooding. So this allowed us to identify the priority sectors and solutions, natural solutions or nature-based solutions at the scale of this full catchment basin. And so this is very interesting work, and there's a lot of documentation on it. If you're interested, we can speak about that. So in conclusion, I think it's important to reduce our vulnerability, long-term vulnerability, and avoid damage. And for that, well, it's necessary to increase our resiliency and the resistance of our territory, and certainly putting ecosystem solutions in place. So that's what we really do try to advocate for. And so I think anticipating is in quotes here, but I think that that's very important. And so we're trying to also mitigate the risks, like I mentioned, and the impacts of climate change preventively upstream. And so everything that we've developed and continue to develop, we're trying to maintain. We want to be avant-garde and to be in Saint-Quentin and Fred and Edmundston. These are kind of like a lab, but this has allowed us to create applied research, place for us to do this applied research and to adapt and to develop different methodologies and to learn to master them. And our vision is to be able to deploy or roll out these capacities and these approaches and this expertise in other catchment basins across New Brunswick and in other regions. I think that the need is there with the reality, with the climate crisis that we're experiencing now, and that continues to worsen. And so in terms of planning, well, we're going to turn this into recommendations and a plan for management of natural assets. We prepared that with Edmundston, and we're also going to work with the CSC in terms of mitigation strategy for flooding risk. There you go. And to conclude, well, thank you for your attention, and thank you to all of our funders and our partners. It would be impossible to bring these projects to life, these various projects. So, and the same goes for all the members of our team. This is a project under this initiative, and we were able to do it without. I couldn't go through each and every one of these groups, but I don't have enough time in the day. But thank you very much once again to everybody. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact me. I put my email at the beginning of the presentation. So it's dodik.gasser@csnb.ca. Thank you very much, Dodik. That was a great presentation. We have a little bit of time for questions at the end of the webinar. But for now,
Alistair joined the City of Charlottetown's Environment and Sustainability Department in 2020 as the Water Coordinator. and looking forward to hearing from him about the work in Charlottetown, as well as their challenges in responding to the pressing impacts of climate change.
Sorry about that. If I bring it into presentation mode, can you see that?
Yeah, you're good.
All right. So thanks so much for having me. As I introduced, my name's Alice Thurozon. I work with the city's Environment and Sustainability Department, as well as the water utility a bit on things relating to water conservation, natural areas, watershed management, flooding. And I'm going to go through some of the projects we've done over the past few years as they relate to all of this. And I just want to also recognize that we are gathered, or I'm gathered here on the traditional and unceded territory of the Abiguid First Nations. Yeah, so I have a few different categories I'm going to go through. First, just mapping assets, the few initiatives we've done to date, and some of the natural infrastructure projects we've done, and then a bit about Hurricane Fiona at the end. So I'm going to start off by talking about our natural asset inventory. So we developed this in 2021 with the Municipal Natural Asset Initiative, who I think recently changed their name, but it was part of a larger project with like a cohort of around 30 municipalities across Canada. And they'd received funding to create these initial natural asset inventories that really help municipalities start off on the path towards natural asset management. And as part of that, we had this dashboard here, which is showing a screenshot of, but they also produced a final report, which included a risk assessment for our natural assets. I'm just going to talk about the dashboard here. So on the left, you can see kind of a map of the city of Charlottetown, and it's broken up into sub-watershed or sub-catchment areas. And this is mapping on the right, the natural assets across the city. And I think that excludes agriculture. But as you can see from the middle graph there, agricultural land is by far the largest natural asset we have within the city. There's still quite a lot of farmland, especially near kind of the outskirts where our kind of suburbs are expanding. But then we have forests, wetland, water, and then shrub and grassland. So that makes up the different categories that are used for assets within this inventory. I know it can be broken up differently. And it was produced from provincial GIS data mainly. They have a land classification shapefile that was used that has all the forest and wetlands, things like that. We also brought in other things like our path networks, our parks, other things that give some more, some other definition to our natural assets. And in the middle there, you can see, based on the assessment, it was determined that about 31.1% of our municipalities is covered in natural assets. And at the top, there's a few different categories. There's the summary page, which is this is showing. There's the asset registry, which is just like the spreadsheet you can bring into Excel or GIS. And then there's the condition summary. So as part of this, they did a kind of rudimentary condition assessment, which involved the surface permeability, adjacent land use type, road density, and relative asset size. And each individual asset got a score for those 4 categories. And then it was given a total score. And from there, they were broken up into categories where they were either good, fair, poor, or very poor. And as you can see in the middle, again, another graph with the green and then the pink, where pink is the poor. So you can see about through this assessment, it classified 54% of our forest assets as poor, 39 as fair and then 7 as good. Because it's pretty rudimentary, we did have some of our forestry team to go to some of these sites and when they actually do the kind of ground truthing, the in situ looking at it, some of those scores don't line up, but it's a good kind of indication based on size for things like connectivity and stuff like that. So one of our other inventories here is our park and street tree inventory. So this was produced back in 2015, I believe. And this includes data for all the street trees and park trees throughout the city that are not part of larger forested or natural areas. So we're not going into, say, a larger natural park and measuring every single tree, but for things like on our city easements, more manicured parks, we have an inventory of all these trees. So it's a bit, there's a lot of dots. The green ones are city owned. The blue indicate that they're owned by someone else. And what's really interesting about this is it actually gives kind of a quantitative, a number for the ecological services these are providing. So our other natural asset inventory is really a first step. It doesn't really take into account the ecological services, but this one's pretty cool because you can see it says it's about 1.6 million per year of ecological benefits where the greenhouse gas, water, energy, air quality, and property benefits. And every one of these trees, you can kind of click on the dot and it'll bring up another screen that'll give information on the species, the location, the DBH, canopy spread, conditions. And they use this, our urban forestry team uses this to monitor, update it while they do things like invasive species monitoring and treatments, things like that. And here's just, if you click on one of the dots, this is what pops up. So I clicked on this one after doing kind of like a query and to look at which ones are kind of the biggest trees within Charlottetown. And you can see this, the linden there in the bottom left from the street view. It's quite a large tree. It has 3 different trunks coming up from it. So I should have mentioned that at the beginning, but I did compile a little document with all the links to these dashboards. So if you do want to go and take a look, they're much more interactive to go and look at yourself when you have the time. Another way of looking at our forested natural assets is through canopy cover. So whereas our natural asset inventory only looked at the land cover classification, the canopy cover is going to look at everywhere there's trees providing canopy cover, providing the shading benefits. So this was actually done in-house. We were talking to the GIS coordinator at the time and we were asking questions and he basically said, I'll give it a shot. And using aerial photography from 2020, I believe, and LiDAR data, he was able to do supervised classification using NDVI, which is a remote sensing way of detecting vegetation. And from that, this is the map that was produced, where obviously green is where we have canopy cover within the city from trees. And it's about 22% currently, which based on a previous assessment years back, it's about the same. So with our growing development, we haven't lost a lot of canopy. That may have changed with Hurricane Fiona, but we'll touch on that a bit later. And just on the right, I pulled 2 areas to zoom in on to show the top one's kind of like a newer subdivision and the bottom's downtown Brighton, Victoria Park, which has a much older established area. So you can really see, I think it's clear which neighborhood you probably want to live in based on the tree cover. As one of the things we struggle with is a lack of requirement to plant new trees in new subdivisions. Kind of changing kind of away from natural assets for a minute. We also have a food asset map that was produced by the Charlottetown Food Council. And this was kind of created to better understand where our existing food system is within Charlottetown and kind of identify areas where it could be improved. So recently there was a CBC article, I think, saying that PEI was once again the leading the country in food insecurity. So it's certainly something that we take seriously when we're developing community gardens and programs like that to try and reduce that. So it'll show here the different symbols are for where you can buy food, where you can grow food, learn about it, where it's kind of distributed. And then there's also like the charitable, like food banks and other community fridges, things like that. And when we do talk about natural assets, especially tree canopy cover, there's sometimes differences throughout the city when it comes to the socioeconomic factors. So on the right, again, for people unfamiliar with the city, a right is the map of our electoral wards. So where our different councillors represent, and there's 10 different wards. And on the left is a map we made recently from the 2021 census data. So it breaks the city down into the dissemination areas. So it's about the smallest area we can get geographic data for based on the census. And the map is showing the percent of households in these area who have a after-tax income of less than 50K. So oftentimes 50K for programs is used as a low income indicator. So you can see there's definitely areas, especially closer to our urban core, where there's a higher percentage of lower income residents. So we often use this type of analysis when we're considering grant applications, when we're doing programs like our Better Homes program, or right now we have a program called the Relief program, where we're doing private tree planting. So some of those is we're targeting specific wards where there's less canopy cover or there's a lower income, things like that. And of course, another way you can break up the city is watersheds. So on the left, we have the watersheds that all partially fall within the city's boundaries. And since about 2017, we've been partnering with Holland College's Environmental Applied Science Technology program and the local watershed groups Ellens Creek and Wrights Creek to do an ecological pond study, where we go to all the ponds within the city to get water quality parameters. They do cabin to get macroinvertebrate biotic indexes. And basically last year they did a 5-year report where they compared the findings and made an index, which you can see on the top right. That's the 2022 data. And then on below that is the comparison from 2018 to last year. And what's interesting is there's a lot of variety between years, which is for a lot of reasons, but the ponds on the right, which all score a little bit higher, are all part of the Wrights Creek watershed. So it's interesting to look at kind of the assets, aquatic assets from that standpoint. So I won't talk too much about it. So next we're going to talk about some of our natural infrastructure projects, starting with this living shoreline site demonstration site we did. So this here is in the background. You can kind of see the Queen Elizabeth Hospital. This site is right near a road to the hospital, an active transportation trail, and it's right on our harbor. So you can see this is what was there before. It was a gabion wall that was starting to fail. And as part of a project in partnership with the PEI Watershed Alliance, who was leading a project that was going to do some of these natural infrastructure installations. We were fortunate to be part of that, and this site was one which we, with the help of the province and some others, we were able to turn into a living shoreline site. And with the help of just a different day, it even looks nicer with the weather, but you can see the gabion wall was replaced with a appropriately leveled slope where they have different species. Closer to the path, you have more foreshore species, and then you have other grass species that are more salt tolerant, close to the bottom. And then there's logs and hay bales there that help secure the site and catch sediments. So I know, I think next week they're talking more about shorelines and again, last week I was able to attend and they talked a lot about rain gardens. So I'm not going to talk too much about this. This was a project that was done through a micro grant program the city does. So our department gives out grants up to $2,500 for projects that relate to the city's integrated community sustainability plan. So this was installation done by the Ellens Creek Watershed Group at one of our local elementary schools. And then finally, I have another example here, which is a bioswale within one of our community parks. So this park used to have and still has some issues with flooding. It used to be quite bad that they couldn't even use the ball diamond at certain points of the year. So kind of making this bioswale, enhancing it a bit, it was able to help with some of those issues. But I won't talk too much about it. And I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the Hurricane Fiona damage. There's been a lot of drone imagery and images of street trees falling over, and we unfortunately lost a lot of trees. So I did ask one of our urban forestry officers about it, and he told me that from that street and park tree inventory, they had documented about 1,550 trees lost, and they estimate that about 5,000 trees across the city have been lost from the hurricane. So it's quite a significant impact. And what you're seeing here is Victoria Park, the main park downtown, which has unfortunately took quite a lot of damage there. Here's a picture of one of previously it was one of the largest American elms in the city. It had a DBH of almost 150 centimeters, 143. And unfortunately, it was one of the trees we lost. And as part of going forward, they're really for these heritage trees that are quite large. They're looking at different projects in which they could use them. I know in the past when Dutch elm disease kind of caused us to lose a lot of our elms, they made a lot of things like pens and furniture out of them to kind of make use of them rather than just kind of having them used for other ways. Finally, a project that we partnered with the UPEI Climate Lab on. This was about a month or so after Hurricane Fiona. We worked with the Climate Lab, who does a lot of work with drones and other geographic things like GIS assessments, satellite data. So the highlighted sites on the left are where we had some drone flights flown, and they also did using satellite imagery, a comparison of before and after Fiona to determine where the most loss occurred. And all of these sites are city owned. So they're all natural areas where we lost, unfortunately, quite a bit of trees. And on the right, that image is, I believe it's from Victoria Park, and it's just an example of kind of resolution the drone imagery gives us. So it'll all help us determine where the loss was, how we can kind of better manage our natural areas in the future, what species we could maybe plant that would be better adapted to future events. And this here is one of the example of the analysis done using the satellite imagery. So this is the Victoria Park again, natural areas, demonstrating using the NDVI to determine where the changes occurred and which areas had the highest loss. And of the sites they did this work on, they determined that I think Victoria Park had the highest loss of the 5 or 6 sites at about 12.42% vegetation loss. And I'm sure that's kind of gone up as they're going in there and doing the maintenance work to remove and leave some of this debris there. So it's also an interesting time for the city as we've started developing a climate action plan. So all of these assets and previous projects will really help us determine where we want to focus on, where we need more information to better manage these assets in the future. So through the first phase, which was mainly community and stakeholder consultation, some background research, and seeing what other jurisdictions are doing in the climate action world, they were able to come up with some guiding principles and 9 focus areas. So some of these, I think they're still subject to change as we move into the second phase, where we're going to actually develop the climate action plan and continue that consultation throughout the process. So it's definitely a lot to think about. I think for Hurricane Fiona, for a lot of people, was a sort of wake-up call as to what climate change can look like moving forward. It's obviously quite a significant event that's occurred, but I'm going to stop now and make sure there's time for questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Alistair. And yeah, really interesting to hear about the work that Charlottetown has done, and also know how you've had to pivot and respond to the impacts of Hurricane Fiona. We have a few minutes for questions now, and I know at the end as well, both our speakers will share their contact info, and you can reach out later if you have more questions. But if you have any questions, feel free to write them in the chat, or you can raise your hand and we can ask you to unmute and pose the question. And you could write the question in either language. Donc, si vous avez des questions, s'il vous plaît, posez
If you have any questions, please ask them in the chat or raise your hand and ask them.
Dans la langue de votre choix.
In the language of your choice.
Also, if Alistair or Dodic, you have questions for each other as well, feel free to ask them of each other in this time.
Yeah, I guess I can just add, I know a lot of the work that we have done has been, we've had a lot of back and forth with other municipalities, with provincial government, with nonprofits. So it's always great to have those conversations. We learn a lot.
You see one question in the chat for you, Alistair. Did staff do the work for the street tree inventory in Charlottetown?
That is a good question. The actual software was using Tree Keeper, and I believe I'm going to try and get the name of the organization here that helped us out with that. It was kind of before I started with the city, so we received funding to do it through Tree Canada, and TD to the environments. And it was the Davy Resource Group was hired to gather the data on all those trees, but it is our urban forestry staff that do go out, monitor, update it. But the initial, I think, data was all completed by that contracted out.
Are there any other questions from?
I got one that was maybe sent as a direct message.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's, are you working with the Living Lab project? So personally, or as a city, I don't believe we have been involved at all with the Living Lab project. I know agriculture, Agri-Food Canada, the climate, they've had a lot of different projects. And I got to actually go out and see one. I think it was out close to Surrey at one of the fields they had, where they were doing lots of monitoring of water going in throughout, using drones to do remote sensing work to see, monitor everything going into the field. And they were planting all kinds of willows where the water was leaving. So no, I haven't been involved and probably not the best person to talk about it.
I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat or hands raised, and since we're really close to the time, I want to thank both Alistair and Dodek for coming in and sharing about your work here today and for being willing to put your contact info out there as well. And I really encourage anyone attending today, if you have more questions or you want to connect with our speakers, please do reach out after this session. And as mentioned at the beginning, this is the third webinar in a series of webinars learning from communities that have been working towards nature-based climate solutions in Atlantic Canada. And we just shared the link in the chat to the information about the series. We have the next one coming up next week on June 22nd to hear about hybrid infrastructure. One on July 4th, learning more in depth about living shorelines. And then we will have a couple as well later in July on naturalized stormwater retention ponds and wetland restoration, as well as conserving nature as like a main approach to responding to climate change. So thank you so much, everyone. Merci tout le monde pour votre participation aujourd'hui.
Thank you very much for your participation today, and